So when you're thinking about you're a founder or even an aspiring investor, you've really got to get creative and tap into who is part of the community in your community. So values alignment, mission alignment, and start making friends that way so that eventually you do have a Brandon type of person where you can ask them for an introduction to someone else. But more likely than not, so many of us do not have the option but to cold call. But to make that a warm call as opposed to just flat out cold is being part of a community, participating, giving and taking. I think those are some elements that we need to consider, especially if we don't have that solid foundation network that some very privileged folks do have. I think first off that this is a very individual approach that you will have in building a community and leveraging your network based on your personality, maybe even your neurospiciness level. Most of us actually in the startup VC world are ADHD. So being familiar with who you are, I think, is number one, so that you can authentically then connect with people when you're reaching out or even building spaces for community where you can interact with others and others can interact with others. And that's really where you have this, this is where we get at Ganas our thesis on community-driven companies, and they could be funds or founders with their startups that are just thinking about how do we identify these people, because there's always these people in our communities that are so excited to bring value, to help us build a product, to help us sell, to help us scale. So how do we enable them to help us? And how do we continue to help them by providing solutions to their problems, which is what initially should have brought them to the table. So that would be a couple of things that I would say. Again, really understanding who you are, what your approach is, authentically reaching out to folks, and what Brandon said, right? Like value. How can you create this alignment where there is that connection between, hey, I'm here, here's what I offer. And for investors, it's not just money, it should be other things. Mm-hmm. If you think about it from that perspective, all investors have the same product, right? Money. Right. So what else do we have to offer, and what can we kind of like exchange so that there's this balance and the symbiosis of creating this, like, yeah, I want to work with you because I can see that it's give first and exchanging of value. So at first it was, hey, just let's sell to the C-suite, then department leaders, then now the employees, right? And then this massive shift, and Salesforce was huge with it, right? And hey, we can actually sell to these individuals and they will propagate the sale of a product. And so how do you tap into the power of this community? And community being defined as like, it could be people on the sales team. Back in the day when I was making $1 million plus sales in software, hardware, services, it was always a team of people. So how are you able to leverage that power? But to begin with, just to back up into it, is establishing those relationships. And that's why I mentioned that incentive alignment. So similar in sales, where you have to figure out, okay, so if I'm a salesperson, I'm trying to sell to someone, what is it that's going to make them win too? Outside of just even the solution. And oftentimes with B2B sales, it would be if they manage a reduction in expenses or they hit this goal, they'll get a bonus or whatever. So tapping into how do we make this a win-win-win situation? On the investor side, one other thing I'd just like to mention is for so many of us, it's sharing our deal flow, right? It's sharing our deal flow, sharing our expertise, and sharing our learnings, because as we're going, we're like, okay, so where is the market going? We're in this unprecedented time, if you will, for so many of us that, to your point, David, started with interest rates that were not prohibitive of, and didn't bring about this expensive capital that we see here today. So in terms of building community and the network, I mean, newsletters. I am constantly sharing like, hey, keep top of mind, right? Because it is true, people don't like to be spammed. But if you are sharing knowledge that wants to be absorbed, people really like that. I always encourage founders, hey, look, you're going to have some sort of update anyway. So those warm leads that you may have from an investor perspective, just keep sending it to them and then check in, because maybe they were a no at the beginning, but they can continue, and then the same thing happens for investors, because we're also fundraising, right? So keep people in the know. And so it's not transactional, right? So you're giving. You can share information that is helpful to you. On the investor side, it could be like, this is what I'm finding in this market and how to fundraise. On the founder side, it could be like, oh, this is what we've discovered in the market. And ideally the people that they're targeting, the audience of their newsletter or whatever, or even their content, wherever it may be, LinkedIn or WhatsApp or whatever, is resonating. So you're building a relationship without actually doing one-on-one, which is one of the hardest things to do. Like, how do you scale a network? But I like what Brandon was talking about in terms of like, how do you tap into this network that you have, which a lot of the time, I think the biggest problem is we don't actually know how big it is, because we forget of the people that we met, and we just have this growing community. And so when people just, right off the bat say like, hey, Lolita, can you help me with this? Whether it's our portfolio or in the community. And I'm like, let me check my connections. And one thing I've loved about the Swarm is that you can see the level of warmth you have, like the strength in relationships, and then being able to even filter on expertise and things like that. So you more like quickly, even me, who I'm connected to these people first degree, I'm in it. Oh yeah, that's right. David is an expert in this. Brandon is an expert in that. Scott is and now that is so important, because having that knowledge of even how to leverage your community, because that's like the next step, right? You have a community. How do you leverage it? We are a solo GP fund, but we have hundreds of people in our community as investors, as mentors. We have our portfolio companies. We have speakers from our events, all sorts of different people that it's hard to remember, but it's easier when you have a system and a platform like the Swarm to be able to tap into the expertise and be able to do that matching, and even share your network so that the founders can tap into it and say, oh, can you introduce me to this person? It's just easier. For us, looking at pre-seed or very early on startups, it starts with the kind of culture and approach that the founders have. And there is definitely a DNA to those that are very community driven. Oftentimes they have already, in one way or another, been those leaders and proven that they can enable others in the community to achieve goals. And when you turn that into a business's DNA, then it becomes a lot easier for people, if they're sellers or wherever they are in their journey, anyone in the company will feel a lot more comfortable about being able to build a brand. So these kinds of founders will always be thinking, whether it's the customers, whether it's their employees, how do we make it easy and make it okay to start these brands internally to help us expand the community, and to think from a go-to-market strategy, how do we get the wheels in motion? So it's not a one-to-many, it's a many-to-many approach in terms of the community, which then can help kick off that marketing sales flywheel. In particular, when you're doing like a PLG, just clear software kind of sale that doesn't require as much of that account executive requirement, especially not at the beginning of a startup's journey and early angel pre-seed stages. And I actually think that maybe giving some examples could be really helpful for the audience. So at Carta, I think we probably all follow, their marketing lead, and he's constantly posting data, right? And now so many people have their eyes on Carta because he's constantly posting data, and everyone's like, well, this is actually really relevant to everything we're doing. So let's follow him. And by way of that, now Carta has a bigger top funnel, right? Another company that's really great, a great example is Notion, one that so many folks know, right? And they literally have a community of people who are making six figures, teaching people how to use Notion or selling templates. And just speaking with the CRO at Notion, like she's like, this is our go-to-market like community. It is part of how we are differentiated, how we're growing so quickly. And so you start to see this, and it could be B2B, but it could also be B2C, all kinds of business models. And I think that's something else that we need to step back and just acknowledge, that it's all business models that can be leveraging this. And there's good use cases in all of them. So if you're a founder out there thinking, how do I leverage the power of community? Definitely look at existing examples. From a founder perspective, what we usually talk about is community ROI. So how can the community help with revenue? In terms of operations, how can a community help you with recruiting? And then for insights, it's how can your community help you actually create the product? So depending on where you are on the journey of building your company, it's literally thinking, what can I leverage the community for and also be helpful to the community on, right? So that would be my tactical: know your target, know your goal for the community, get focused, and then always make sure there's win-wins in the scenarios.